Hey everybody, it is great to be here again with you tonight. We are continuing our journey through the 12, or the minor prophets as some might call them. And tonight we're going to be focusing on Nahum. One of the coolest things about the book of Nahum, or the funnest things, is actually getting to say the name. It's one of those ones where you really get to go Nahum. So we're going to start with our questions, and it feels like, at the very least, like they're getting a little repetitive. So when it comes to this prophet, we ask the question, who is he? The same answer is, we don't know, right? We don't know anything about him. We know his name, and we know where he claims to be from. And interestingly, this is the only time in all of the Bible where he shows up. We have Nahum of Elkosh, or your text may actually say in Elkoshite, or something similar to that. We don't know if that's a place or if that's a person. And so not only do we not really know who he is, we don't know if we're given a lineage or if we're given a place of origin. Tradition, of course, has tried to find various places where this might be. And the most likely answer, if this is a place, is that it would be from the region of Galilee, which in the New Testament is where Jesus is from. And the Pharisees, kind of in a retort to people in one place, will actually say, search the scriptures and see that nothing good comes from Galilee. Well, if this is from Galilee, if Nahum is from Galilee, he would be our second of the 12. Jonah is also from Galilee. And so there are prophets, despite what the Pharisees say, who actually come from the region of Galilee. And sometimes maybe that could serve as a warning for us, just reading through the introduction here of Nahum in verse 1. Sometimes it might serve as a warning for us to be careful that we don't become haughty in what we think we know in the Bible. Or to rush to judgment. So before we even get into the book, just kind of trying to figure out where he's from, and maybe being from the region of Galilee, it's a good reminder that, like those Pharisees, we don't want to be like them. We need to be careful that we don't make similar mistakes, where we just assume that we know everything and our knowledge is infallible, to be humble and to be ready to be corrected sometimes. And so with that, let's go on to the next part. Our next question is going to be, when is he writing? So when is Nahum writing his letter or his book? And this we do know a little bit about because of what is mentioned in the writing itself. If you look in chapter 1 and verse 12, one of the things that is noted is it says that they are at full strength, right? And there's many of them. And so at this point, this letter is written to Nineveh, or to the nation of Assyria. At this point, when it's being written, they're still kind of at the height of their power. And there's another event, or there's two other events that are going to kind of help us peg a date for this. One is going to be the destruction of Nineveh itself, which is going to happen much later than the first event, which is the destruction of Thebes by Nineveh itself. So the city of Thebes, or the region of Thebes, is going to be destroyed in about 663 BC by one of the most famous kings of Nineveh, or of Assyria, Ashurbanipal. And so he's going to go through and he's just going to destroy this region that for a long time people thought was untouchable. It's one of those impenetrable regions. And he goes in and he just kind of takes it over. And he carries back all the plunder from this jewel of a region. And he will be quite a prominent and quite a powerful king. And underneath him, there will be many atrocities committed. And he will eventually die. And he'll die in around 627 BC. And after his death in 627 BC, Nineveh takes a sharp dip. Right? The nation of Assyria becomes weak almost immediately. All of the nations that they had kind of subdued begin rising up, in particular the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans. And they'll get some allies and they'll come together, and not long after Ashurbanipal's death, they will actually themselves come and conquer Assyria. And that seems to be what the book is about. So between his death in 627 BC and the conquest of Thebes in 663, sometime in there this is written. And the reason why that's kind of the conclusion we come to is if this letter is written after Ashurbanipal's death, it would be like predicting the Civil War in 1863, right? It's not a big deal at that point. And so the power of this prediction is that it is given after the destruction of Thebes. It's going to look back to that event, and it's going to say that something like that is coming to Assyria. The power of that is the same that you have with Jesus in the New Testament when he predicts wars and conflict and conquest and the destruction of Jerusalem in the middle of the Pax Romana. And so here he is standing in the middle of the greatest peace in the ancient world, saying there's going to be great conflict and destruction and desolation. Well, that's just ridiculous. And so here Nahum is doing a very similar thing. He's sitting in the middle of this period where the Assyrian Empire just seems untouchable, and he predicts their downfall. And so that is the power of this prophecy. If you're an Israelite, if you're a Hebrew, and you're listening to this prophecy, if you're an Assyrian and you're listening to this prophecy, on the face of it, it seems ridiculous. But then in 626, the year after Ashurbanipal's assassination, and things become very sketchy very quickly, all of a sudden, this begins to have substance and meaning, and you begin to question, could this really happen? And indeed it does. Assyria will be defeated by the Babylonians, and they will be carried off into captivity, and all of the things that they had been doing to other people will be done to them. And so that's kind of when we have a time for when this is written. Sometime between the destruction of Thebes, 663, and the fall or the death of Ashurbanipal, which is the beginning of the fall of Assyria. And so we're going to kind of peg this at around 650 BC or so. Far enough after the fall of Thebes, but before the death of Ashurbanipal, to the point where this would have had, a really a significant impact when the events came to pass. And so that's the date we're going to work with. Outside of that, it's probably somewhere in between those two dates. It could be anywhere between 663 and 627. But we're going to work with 650 because that seems like a nice number and it's easy to remember. So about 650 BC. So what's going on? Why is he writing? What's the purpose of this letter? Well, it is directed to the Assyrians. And so first off, one of the things that we need to remember is that God isn't the God of the Jews only. We do kind of have a tendency to think that in the Old Testament, God really only cares about the Hebrew people and everybody else is just kind of like a second fiddle, and he's not really concerned with them so much. That's not the case. God has always been concerned with all of the people, right? He is the God of all creation, of all people in all places. Now that doesn't mean that everybody gets the same revelation. And so when we're dealing with the Hebrews, that we are given a special people group, the Israelites, and they do get special revelation, and they have a special relationship with God. But that doesn't mean that everybody else doesn't matter. It just means that God is doing something in particular with this one group of people, and he is working through them in a unique way as far as the rest of humanity is concerned. But here, Nahum and a couple of the other 12 and some of the other prophets, there are clear indicators that God does indeed care about these people, and he sends prophets to them. We have other prophets in other places, Melchizedek being a good example, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, another example, a priest in Midian, a priest in Salem, both of them. And so there are priests and prophets and seers sent out to these other nations. God has made himself known. We just don't always know how or when or why or through whom with all of the other nations. With Israel, we have this body of revelation, this book that we call the Bible, and so we have a lot of that, all of that recorded. But Nahum is geared toward the Assyrians. And so what is going on there? Why is he geared toward the Assyrians, and what is he saying in particular? Well, a couple things besides letting us know, hey, God cares about everybody. A couple things besides that is that it could be that God is telling his people that ultimately he's faithful to his promises. He is going to protect them. If you're an Israelite, Samaria has been destroyed by Assyria in 722. They've been carried off into captivity, and it just seems like the universe has come to an end. One of the things that this prophet's declaration would do is let everyone know that, hey, that happened. But that's not the end. God is going to deal with Assyria. He is going to destroy the destroyer. He is going to take vengeance upon the people who treated his people, who treated the Israelites in such a disrespectful and disgraceful manner. God used Assyria to bring judgment, excuse me, but then Assyria themselves, because of their activity, made themselves liable to judgment. And that activity is actually going to take place, a big chunk of it at least, under the reign of Ashurbanipal. There are great atrocities that are committed, and some of the accounts and some of the ancient histories that we have of the actions of the people of Assyria, they're really not repeatable. Right? They're really not something that we should talk about if we want to keep this family friendly. So we're not going to. Just understand that they are not innocent, that they are a terror and they are a dread on all of the other nations in the region. And so when we think about that's one of the reasons, is that these people have brought judgment upon themselves. Another reason is that the nation of Judah has, in a sense, kind of become a vassal to Assyria, in large part, from the time of the destruction of Israel. And in that, in the very least in that, and probably before that quite a bit too, there has been a lot of what we would call syncretism. So that's a word that we need to kind of latch onto and understand what it means. It means the combination of two different things, two different ideas, two different religions maybe coming together. And so what the Hebrew people did, what the Jews did, is they had their God, but they began to bring in all of the Assyrian gods too, to the point where we're going to look in just a second and over in 2 Kings 21. 2 Kings 21, you can see some of the things that are going on with this king named Manasseh. So Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign. He reigns 55 years. Interestingly enough, he has the longest reign in Jerusalem. His mother's name is Hephzibah, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out from the people of Israel. So there's all those things. In verse 3, he rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah his father had destroyed, and he erected altars for Baal, and he made Asherah, as Ahab the king of Israel had done, and he worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. These are references to gods that were worshipped in Assyria. So not only is he bringing in the gods of the nations that were driven out, the various Canaanites, but now you also have these references to some of the Assyrian gods that they would worship, the host of heaven in particular. And so you've got these things going on where the Hebrew people are dragging Assyria into Israel, and in a sense making Judah Assyria itself. And so part of the reason perhaps for this judgment that is coming is to make a firm distinction. Look at these people, look at what they've done, and look at what the end result is. And then kind of maybe turning the focus to the Israelites, that the letter is not written to the Israelites, but then maybe turning to them with this prophecy. It's, look, this is what happened to Assyria. And if you are playing at being Assyria, then this is what's going to happen to you. And ultimately it will. And not all that long after Assyria faces judgment, right? Because in 586, Jerusalem will be sacked by Babylon and just completely destroyed. And so it doesn't take that long for these things to happen when we kind of step back and look at the history of what's going on. But maybe one of the reasons why we have this recorded in the Hebrew scriptures is because it's a warning for God's people. If you become like the nations round about you, then your end will be the same as the nations round about you. You don't get special treatment because you're Israel. In fact, you're kind of held to a higher standard of holiness, and if you fail to meet that standard, then the same judgment that they face, you are going to face yourself. And that's an important lesson for us as Christians. We are going to be held to a standard of holiness that is greater, right, than the world around us. People who don't know, God doesn't expect them to just magically do things that they don't know to do. But if we as believers have the revelation, we have a relationship with God, we know Him, we know who He is, what He wants, what He desires, and then we refuse to do it, how much greater is that condemnation? And so the message still stands firm. Look at the judgment that God has said that would come upon those who reject Him. Now, if you as His people also act like that, if you also reject Him, if you also are faithless, why should you escape that judgment? And so that's a very powerful lesson in this prophecy, is that God's people are not going to escape the judgment of the nation of Assyria if they behave like Assyria themselves. So that's important for us to see and important for us to remember. So that's going to kind of get us then into the text of Nahum, and we're going to start off in chapter 1. And one of the neat things, it starts in about verse 2, one of the neat things that you can see here is this declaration of God's character. And this actually is very similar. It's kind of lifted from Exodus 34. And so we're going to turn over there for just a second, over in Exodus 34, where we can see really for the first time God describing who He is. Where we see God acting, we know that He is the God of creation. He has some various interactions with people. He kind of describes Himself in various ways, like He is the God who hears, He is the God who sees. He gets those kinds of descriptions. In Exodus, at the beginning of Exodus, He is the God who is. Right? I am that I am. He is the God who is. But here in Exodus 34, when Moses asks to see God's glory, right, really for the first time, God tells us, this is what I am. Here is who I am. And so let's look at the text there over in Exodus chapter 34. Moses is going to be remaking the tablets. You can see that there at the beginning of the chapter. And then in verse 5, God is going to descend. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And so this is interesting. The Lord is with Moses, proclaiming the name of the Lord, who will also be passing in front of Moses. How does that happen? This could be an intimation, right? A hint that there is one God who exists in multiple persons. Otherwise, I don't know how this happens. So here you go. Moses is there in verse 5. The Lord comes, is next to him, proclaiming the name of the Lord. And that proclamation is, right, here is who I am. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious and slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. And at that point, you're like, oh, wow, I thought he was a serious God. Right? I thought that he was going to actually hold people accountable, but here he is. He's love and faithfulness. He forgives iniquity and transgression and sin. What do we have to worry about? And that's the danger of saying something like God is love. What we have to be careful we don't do, right? I'm not saying don't say that. Please don't misunderstand. God is absolutely love. And I hope in the 12, we will see that that love is the driving force behind everything that God does. He is love. But the danger in saying that is we take God's definition of love and we replace it with our own. We take God's definition of grace and we replace it with something that is cheap. One writer writing in World War II, actually during World War II, or maybe right before, would actually talk about something called cheap grace, in which we cheapen the grace of God by expecting that he would give it to us without any commitment on our part. And what we see here is that yes, God is merciful and gracious and slow to anger. He does abound in steadfast love and faithfulness. He keeps that steadfast love for thousands. He forgives iniquity and transgression and sin. Thankfully he does, or nobody could be saved. But the converse of that is, these are all defined in God's terms. And it doesn't mean this person who doesn't care what you do, he's going to love you no matter what. It is true that God's love is always present, but it is also true that God holds his people accountable. He holds all creation accountable, because not only is he these things, but in all of these things he is holy. And the ultimate overriding characteristic of God is that he is holy, holy, holy. And God will move to defend that holiness at any time and every time it is attacked. And that is one of the messages of Nahum. When Assyria came through and they acted as the judge, and when they came as the destructors for the nation of Israel, they did it in an unholy way. And when their conduct became unbecoming, right, when they were used as the Lord's chosen instrument, that made them holy. Just like the furniture, when it's used in the temple, it becomes holy. But they themselves behaved in an unholy way, and therefore the only recourse is to punish them as well. Right, if you take something, a shovel from the temple, my favorite example, if you take the shovel that's used to get the ashes out from underneath the altar of burnt offering and you use it for anything else, it can never be used for the altar of burnt offering ever again. And so here, that's this idea. God is all of these things, but that doesn't mean he won't punish sin. It doesn't mean he doesn't hold people accountable. It doesn't mean that he won't defend his holiness, because he doesn't stop there. Look at what it says after this. Yes, he does all these great and amazing things. Otherwise, we would have no hope. However, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting iniquity on the fathers, on the children, and the children's children, to the third and the fourth generations, or incidentally about 70 years. Right? Moses quickly bowed his head down toward the earth and worshipped, and said, "If now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people. Pardon our iniquity and sin, and take us for your inheritance." So the proper response to this declaration of who God is not to say, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that. It's to beg for that grace and that mercy, to beg for God's guidance and help, and to throw yourself down in worship before the God who grants that mercy, even though judgment is what we truly deserve. And that is what we see Moses doing. And that really is the proper response to God's love in every situation. To be grateful and thankful that God is a God of love, mercy, kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Thankfully he does that, because if he didn't, we would be without hope. But also in that gratefulness, to be careful not to take advantage, to remember that God is holy and that we are unworthy. And we are only counted as worthy because he is gracious, and to throw ourselves down in worship before this God who forgives what we could not earn and who makes right the wrong that we have done. And so that's kind of what we see. And that actually is the introduction to Nineveh, or to Nahum. When we come and we look at our text, we see that here. God is a jealous God, an avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries. He keeps wrath for his enemies. So that's kind of the part that we read at the end, that God punishes sin and iniquity. He's not a pushover. He defends his holiness. He keeps his name pure. Now, he is faithful to his promises, both the promise to forgive and the promise to judge. And then after that, you get to the first part. So we kind of get these things in reverse order. And so the Lord is slow to anger and great in power. And the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. And so that's our introduction to God. God is doing these things because of who God is. He chose Assyria. He made them his holy instrument, and they were not unholy. And so then, this God who is goodness, this God who is love, this God who is holy, he is moving to avenge and defend his holiness. And now, again, we have to be careful that we don't associate our definition of good with this, our definition of love with this. God's definition and ours are not always the same. And so we constantly have to go back and say, what does God mean when he says that? How is God loving? How is he gracious? How is he holy? And we have to remember that sometimes this love and this grace and this mercy manifests itself actually in judgment, in chastisement. You can see this over in Hebrews chapter 12. So in Hebrews chapter 12, the writer there is going to say in verses 3 through about verse 13, he's going to talk about how the Lord chastens those whom he loves. So look over there. Here he's going to tell us, have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? Well, when a parent cares about their child, or any caregiver, when they care about the child in their care, they exercise discipline. Right? They make sure that there is an order, that things are done the proper way. And here, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastises every son whom he receives. And so yes, as a little kid, when you spank or you punish or you chastise a child, anytime, really adults too, right? I don't like to be punished. Anytime you receive some kind of chastisement, at the moment it's not pleasurable, and you think the person doing it must hate you. Right? Why would they do this to me unless they just don't like me at all? And it turns out that there's a reason. There's a reason why I tell my kids they can't stick metal things in light sockets. It's a bad idea. Right? And there's a reason why God gives us his instruction. There's a reason why God tells us things, why he tells us who we ought to be and things we ought to avoid, because he knows what is best. And with the people of Israel, he promises them chastisement when they disobey. And that is what you're seeing here, not only with Israel, but also with the Assyrians and with many of the other people groups that God will be dealing with. He defends his holiness, he keeps his name, and he shows his love for people and ultimately to bring about the good, always. All right, so that's going to get us to the next thing. He is goodness and love. He doesn't change. And so when we come over here and we're looking again in chapter 1, we see this God who doesn't change. He is the same now as he was when he was talking to the Israelites in Exodus chapter 34. He is the same God to the Israelites as he is to the Assyrians. He doesn't change who he is based on who he's talking to. And have you ever had friends or relations or people that you know where they acted one way with one group of people and a different way with another group of people? And I mean, they're just like two-faced in that regard. That's not God. God is the same. He is the same yesterday, today, tomorrow. His character is unchangeable. And here we see that he is the same God when he is talking to and about the Assyrians as when he is talking to and about the Israelites. He is the same God today when he talks to and about Christians. This description of God in Exodus 34 is eternal. This is who God is. It's his nature. It's his character. This is the God that we turn to today, tomorrow, and every day, and everlastingly when we get to be with him. God is the same. And that's good because that means that God keeps his promises always, and he shows these good things always. And so then we kind of get, in addition here, the kindness and severity of the Lord. God is the God of all the creation, but over that there will be kindness and there will also be severity. And you see this, again, he's dealing now with people who at one time were his chosen instruments, and now he's bringing destruction upon them. Just like with Israel, they were his chosen people, and then he brings destruction. The kindness and severity of God. And this is an important theme throughout the text of Scripture. Paul is going to hint at this in Romans chapter 11. And so he's going to actually say these words, "Note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness, otherwise you too will be cut off." And so this is relational. Those who are in relationship with God are safe. He is kind to them, he defends them, he protects them. But those who have distanced themselves from God, those who have cut themselves off from God, to them there is severity and judgment. And that's what we see here. This is the message of the 12, the message of the prophets. When you are with God, things are good. When you are willing to turn back to God, things are repaired. If you are arrogant and foolhardy and steadfast in your disobedience, then the end result will be judgment. So we see the kindness and the severity of God in chapter 1. And that's going to kind of get us then to the end of this section, where we begin seeing that God is faithful, right? He is faithful to everything that he has said, to everything that he will do, and we should be the same. So let's go back and look at Nahum, and here we go. The conclusion. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, the conclusion in chapter 1 is, "Behold upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace. Keep your feasts, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the worthless pass through you. He is utterly cut off." He is basically about Assyria. They're never going to come and trouble Judah again. They're being cut off. And so he's calling upon these people whom God has protected and delivered to keep their feasts, to be faithful to the Lord. Fulfill your vows, and don't worry about these other people. The Lord has defended you and has protected you. And so our lesson here is that when we see God and we see him fulfilling his promises, our response again to that is worship. So here Judah is receiving the promise that God will protect them and defend them, which you see in the law. And here now he is cutting off, he's bringing down this unstoppable monster of Assyria. And he turns to them and says, okay, your response to this now, people, is to worship. It is to keep the feasts. It is to fulfill your vows, because the Lord has acted, so you should respond. And the way that you respond is with worship and by striving to be holy people. That's the feasts, is the worship, and fulfilling your vows is keeping your word, being like God. Be holy as he is holy. And so this is the response. And this will always be the proper response to God when he does things. When God sends salvation through Jesus Christ, what is the proper response? To worship and to be holy people. We have been redeemed by Christ, and so we come to God in worship and thanksgiving and praise and honor for that great redemption. But we don't stop there. We don't just give that service, that lip service. We actually decidedly change who we are. And we become transformed into this new creation, and we keep the word, right? We keep our promises. We become like Christ. We become like God. And that's really the image here. I've redeemed you. I've saved you. Now become my people. Be like me. And so that's kind of where chapter 1 is going to end. And that's going to get us then into chapter 2, where God is going to turn his attention now to the judgment that is coming upon the people of Nineveh. And so we're going to see this, the scatterer who is coming in chapter 2. Nineveh will be called to action in these first verses here. Man the ramparts, watch the road, dress for battle, collect your strength. I don't think God is encouraging them. I don't think he's saying, hey, there's still hope. You can fight your way out of this. I think his message is there's no hope. You will not be able to fight your way out of this. It's almost a taunt. You go ahead and you do what you think you need to do. And actually, that's going to happen several times throughout this book. God is going to taunt these people and say, man your ramparts, go get the mud, go get the clay you need to patch things up. You do whatever you think you need to. It's not going to work. And that's a powerful lesson for us. Sometimes we kind of get caught up in our own wisdom and our own strength and what we perceive are our own glories, and we think that we can stand against God. And when that happens, God says things like this. Okay, you go ahead. You go ahead and you put soldiers up there and you get ready. You watch the road. You put your armor on. You get all your soldiers together in one place, and we'll see who's going to win. And it's a fool's errand. Right? It is foolish to believe, it's foolhardy to believe that one could stand against the Lord. But if there's anything that we can learn from history, it's that we don't learn that lesson very well. and we continually make the same mistakes. Now, this is on a national level. This is a nation of people who have gone in and who have continually done wicked and evil things. And this judgment is coming on a national level. But if we kind of step down into the forest for a minute and we begin looking at the individual trees, we look at me, myself, my life, how often do I do the same things on a much smaller scale? I know that I can't stand against God. I know I can't defeat him. I know I'm not strong enough. But still I try. I try to outsmart him. I try to look for loopholes. I try to get my way. I forget that God brings every deed to account, that we will give an account for what we do in the flesh, whether good or evil. Sometimes I forget that. And I decide that I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm not going to listen to God. Or I try and sneak behind his back. People haven't changed. And the message of the prophet here in Nahum is that doesn't work. It didn't work for Assyria, and it won't work for individual Assyrians. It won't work for us as the Lord's people, and it won't work for me as an individual. This judgment is coming. And again, it comes down to choice. Like Jeremiah talking to Zedekiah while Nebuchadnezzar is outside the gates. He says, turn now, and the Lord will relent. And so the message, it's always a message of hope. While you are breathing, there is still this message of hope, of this God who desires to forgive. But if we stand proud in our own devices, our own sins, our own machinations, then this is the way the Lord responds. That's fine. If that's what you want, gather your strength, call your troops, man the ramparts, watch the roads, do everything you can. It won't be enough. And that's the terrifying thing, right? That's the severity of God, is that there is nothing I can do that will stop the coming day of judgment. That's why when Paul preached about this to kings, it terrified them. There is nothing you can do. The only thing you can do is to humble ourselves. That's all we can do, is humble ourselves and submit to God. To respond the way that we should respond, to worship him. He is the creator. He loves us, to love him in return, and to be who we ought to be. And so that's kind of what is happening here. God is coming up. He's drawing in his battle array. He taunts these people very much like you can see other ancient warriors doing throughout the Old Testament narrative. And that's what's happening. The next section in verses 3 through 9, and I'm going to do my best to try and keep the text that we look at family friendly. Some of it may slip by. Again, the Bible is not a children's book, but I will do my best. The next section in verses 3 through 9 is the battle begins, right? And so we're seeing now the Lord is coming. And there's an interesting link here in Nahum chapter 2 over to Ezekiel. And so the prophets say some of the same things. Ezekiel talks about the Chaldeans coming with their red shields. And here in Nahum chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, the shield of his mighty men. So the scatterer is bringing this army. The shield of his mighty men is red, and his soldiers are clothed in scarlet. Same picture. Here they come. It's the Chaldeans, right? It's the Babylonians that are coming. And if you were a Hebrew and you were familiar with Ezekiel's prophecy and you knew these things, or when Ezekiel's prophecy comes, you'll be able to kind of put these things together. You'll see how God is working out all of these different plans, and he is making things happen exactly the way that he said they were going to happen. When the Lord speaks, it happens with surety. So here are these red shielded ones coming. When Ezekiel is finally prophesying, it's much later. When Ezekiel is prophesying, the red shielded ones have come again. But this time it's in judgment on Jerusalem, or on Judah. And so here we see in chapter 2, the chariots are flashing with metal, the soldiers are mustered, their cypress spears are brandished, the chariots race madly through the streets, they rush to and fro, they're gleaming torches, they're darting like lightning. It's a fast and it's a furious battle. And so it's not something that the people in Nineveh would have been able to cope with. When this destruction comes, it comes swiftly and it comes powerfully. They're not going to be able to stop it, even to the point that we get this picture in verse 6. It says, the river gates are opened and the palace melts away. Now, sometimes you run into things like this and it's poetic language, right? It's just this really cool picture of a floodgate of destruction and the foundation of the important buildings in the city are washed away. Sometimes it's also predictive. And the interesting thing here is that Nineveh is going to be destroyed partially with a flood, and the Babylonians later are going to be destroyed partially with a flood. And if you go back to Genesis chapter 6, the evil in humanity there is destroyed with a flood. It's almost like water is seen as a destructive thing. And that's significant, because baptism then is a destructive thing. And when we think about baptism and how that kind of links, right, we're taking a bit of a sidestep here for just a moment, I promise. When we think about baptism and the way that that is linked back to the flood and the way that it is linked to all in these various images of destruction, and we're told that we die in baptism, that's the picture. That is the judgment that comes upon the old person that we were, the body of sin and death, the person who is apart from God, who is without God. And baptism comes and that person is killed. And through the Spirit, we are raised as a new person. And so here in verse 6 in chapter 3, or chapter 2 in Nahum, he's not talking about baptism per se, but there is this river that floods through the city. And a destructive force comes. And actually there are accounts, ancient accounts of this actually happening. When the Chaldeans come or the destroyers come, there's a river that runs through the city and there's a gate that controls it. They're going to open it up and flood the city and the foundation of buildings will actually be washed away. And so what you're seeing is very poetic, but it's also predictive. And so this is what's happening. The glory of the people now, in verse 7, is being stripped off. They're being carried away. They're lamenting and they're moaning and they're beating their breasts, right? Signs of great distress and great torment. In verse 8, this city who is powerful and who had nothing to fear previously, now it is a pool whose waters have run away. Right? There is nobody there. Halt, halt, right? You can picture just soldiers just running away from the onslaught, just people fleeing for their lives, and maybe an officer calling the soldiers back. Stand your ground, and nobody comes. And the result then is in verse 9, where the silver is plundered, the gold is plundered, and there is no end of the treasure and of the wealth and all the precious things that Nineveh had been collecting for herself from all the nations, in particular Thebes, this great wealth of a territory, and now all of those things are being plundered. And so the idea here, the picture here is that there is great destruction, or the things that we have in this life, they're easily lost. And putting our stock in those and putting our trust in those things that are easily lost leads to ruin. So in verses 10 through 13, the Lord is going to decree destruction, desolation, and ruin. It is the decree. He's going to again taunt the people. He's going to talk about these lions' dens, and then he's going to finish by saying, where are you? Where are the lions' dens? I am against them. I will burn your chariots. My sword will devour your lions, your warriors. I will cut off your prey from the earth. The voice of your messengers will be heard no longer. And so here is this great judgment that we see coming. The Lord is the one bringing it. And the end result is going to be that Nineveh is judged. And one of the things that the 12 do is one of the questions that they deal with is God's righteousness in judgment. It is right for God to do this. He isn't being unfair. He isn't being temperamental. He waits until it is time. He is gracious and merciful and patient, right? Long-suffering, like we read in the description in Exodus 34. That's who God is. But this destruction is justified. When you look in chapter 3, and I'm going to be very careful with the text here, when you look through chapter 3, it is a bloody city. It is full of lies. It is a terrible place. And again, you can go back if you're interested and look at some of the atrocities that the Assyrian people committed. They're not innocent, right? They are deserving of this. And so verses 1 through 4 in chapter 3, they're kind of like God saying, hey, you have stored up wrath, and just now I'm bringing it. You have been earning all of these things. But now I'm bringing your destruction because of those things. And so that's the first 4 verses in chapter 3. There's some very colorful language there, some interesting pictures, and all of them are negative, right? There's just this idea of God coming and punishing because of these things that the Assyrians have done. And the next thing we see is that they're going to be shamed. And so if you look in verse 5 of chapter 3, behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. And he uses a couple different images there of nakedness that are shameful. He's going to show their nakedness to the nations around them, and it will be embarrassing, is kind of the idea. What he is going to do to them is going to put them to shame. These people who are proud of their might and their splendor and their wealth, they're going to be put to shame. They will be the spectacle that they made of other nations. They will be the ones carried off into captivity. And the response of the nations round about them is that people are going to shrink away from them and say, wasted is Nineveh. Who will grieve for her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? And the implication is that there are none. Right? There is none. And that leads right to the next thing. Why are there none? How come nobody is there mourning? Why is nobody upset at this? And when we think about this, maybe one of the lessons that we can take as individuals is that one of the things that we should be concerned with is bringing God glory in all that we do, to the point where, like you can see with people like Tabitha or James in the New Testament, when they die, there is great lamentation because of who they were and because of the love of God that was illustrated in their lives. We should live in such a way that people can see God in us, so that when we pass from this life, it's a sad thing, because the church, because fellow believers have lost somebody who is a good example of what it means to be led by the Spirit, a good example of what it means to love the Lord with all the heart, with all the soul, with all the mind and strength, a good example of what it means to be faithful in everything, to be those who fulfill what we see in the Beatitudes. That is who we ought to be. Because when we are like Nineveh, there's none. There's no one. Right? And this is what she deserves. You can look at some of the other things that will be said in the rest of the chapter, but she treated the people that she conquered very viciously and very wickedly. And so that gets you to chapter 8. Are you better than Thebes? That sat by the Nile with the water around her rampart, a sea, and water her wall. And so it's just referring to the structure of the city. Cush, her strength, one of her allies. Egypt, too, that without limit. Put and the Libyans were her helpers. And so not only was it well situated, but it had all of these different allies. Even though, despite that, she became an exile and went into captivity. And so what is it about you, Nineveh, that makes you think you're special? What is it about you that makes you think that you're not going to have to suffer the same fate when you do things worse than those people? All right, that's like Jesus talking to the Israelites when he warns them. He talks about the temple is going to be destroyed. In Matthew 23, he talks to the scribes and the Pharisees, and he warns them. He warns them about their hypocrisy. And I have to be careful sometimes the way that I read Matthew chapter 23. I don't know if he's yelling, if he's almost crying when he's speaking. That's really the image I get, because at the end, he says to Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that killed the prophets, how long I would have gathered you together as a hen does her chicks, but you would not. It's that picture that we saw from Hosea of God holding out his arms all day long to a disobedient people. And so here with the Gentiles, the feeling is the same. Are you different? Are you better? What is it that makes you think that you don't have to listen? What is it that makes you think that you don't have to be concerned with finding and following this God of creation? And so the result of this for these people is disaster. Nineveh will be shamed. She's going to suffer the same fate that the nations around her suffered. And when we get to the end of the chapter, there is this picture of the king. He's left alone, and he is by himself. In verse 18, it says, "Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria." The people who would have helped you, right? The viziers, the counselors, the others, the governors in Assyria that would have been a help to the king. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with none to gather them. There's no one. They're all gone. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. Your translation may say mortal. Same thing. Everyone who hears the news about you claps their hands over you. It's a clap of joy, right? People are glad that this has happened. For upon whom has not your unceasing evil come? So this is what you did, and now you are reaping what you sowed. Right? You sowed wickedness, you sowed destruction, you sowed death. Now that is what you're reaping. And so these are very important principled lessons for us as God's people, that this king here dies alone, unhelped, unhealed, because of his sin, because of the things that he did to others, and he refused to turn to the Lord. Right? There is one who could heal. The king, God could, but he refused to turn. And so he's left without anybody, alone, and mortally wounded. That's my condition before I come to the Lord. I'm alone, and I am mortally wounded by sin. And in coming to the Lord, there is a great family that you gain. Mother, brother, sisters, fathers, 100-fold, right? When the disciples ask, what will we gain? We've left everything to follow you. Jesus says, you're going to get everything. That's what you get. You left what you think is important, but it's not. You're going to get something so much greater and so much better. And so as we leave this, here's the end of sin. Nahum does not end on a positive note. It ends with this. But we can take a positive message away from it, because even though this is the result of sin, we are no longer bound to this. We are no longer enslaved to sin. This is no longer our destiny if we are in Christ, because we have one who can heal us. We have a great shepherd who will bind up our broken limbs, who will heal our hurts, who is able to bring us into his family, whereby we receive the spirit of adoption that causes us to cry out, Abba, Father. This is our great hope. That here's the end of the world. This is how the world will ultimately be. But that's not our end. Ours is better. Ours is hopeful. Ours is joyous, because we have the hope of hearing, well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your master. And so even though Nahum doesn't end with that hope that we see in some of the other writers in the 12, we still have hope, because we know that that does not have to be us. That is not the way that our end has to happen because of Christ. I hope this is encouraging. I hope that this helps us to see who God is and to focus on his great character and the great love that he has and the good things that he has in store for those who love him. And I hope it is encouraging us to continue looking through the 12 and to look at these themes that occur repeatedly throughout the scripture. And eventually, when we get to look at the book of Revelation together, these 12 are going to be very significant in understanding that book and seeing where the end is coming. I love you all, and God bless you, and we'll see you again next week.